Hello, everybody. Last 20 minutes, so bear with me through it and we'll get to the end. First of all, I'd like to thank David and Paola for convening and inviting me. And the topic of my talk today is remote documentary. What is it to document virtually? Today I'm going to talk to you about Phantom Pro, a piece of work I've made remotely which looks at the aftermath and reconstruction of Mosul, a city captured by ISIS in 2014 and subsequently destroyed in the battle to defeat them. But first I'm going to talk to you about two pieces of work I've made in the same region over 30 years, which led me to making Phantom Pro. They are separate visually and contextually, but linked through my experiences in the region. The first of these bodies of work is a photo diary I made as a 17-year-old Royal Marines commando on operations in Kurdistan in northern Iraq in 1991. The surrender of the Iraqi army following the Gulf War in the south of the country led the Kurds to rise up against Saddam Hussein. The weakness shown by his surrender was seen as a moment to hit back following the long history of campaigns by him against the Kurds. The Anfal campaign of the late 1980s, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 Kurds, and the notorious use of chemical weapons on the town of Halabja in March of 1988, still fresh in their minds. My unit was part of a US Special Forces task force working with local Peshmerga fighters and other militia groups to halt the advance of the Iraqi army units heading north. We also helped get aid to the Kurdish population who had fled their towns and cities and were living in camps in the mountainous Turkey-Iran, Iranian border areas. This proved very difficult as the Kurds became stuck in these camps and had nowhere further to seek refuge. The regional politics has always suppressed the Kurds, with long histories of Turkey and Iran committing atrocities against them. Apart from protection against the Iraqi army, our role became one of finding routes out of the mountains and guiding them back to their towns and cities. Once we had done this, there were internal conflicts between different Kurdish factions, which we then had to police. The Kurds today are still the largest ethnic group of people in the world who do not have their own recognized state. Before I joined the Marines, I did a diploma in art and design, and when I deployed, my parents bought me a small 35mm pocket camera along with 5 rolls of film. The resulting body of work shows my immediate experience of that and my fellow Marines in this environment, including interactions with Peshmerga and PKK fighters and refugees. They are a snapshot moment made over the course of the 5 months I was there, and very much a teenage Marine's view and not particularly considered. I was injured by my time in Iraq by being exposed to the residue of chemical weapons which Saddam had used against the Kurds. My unit would be helicoptered into areas and entering villages which had been sealed off since being targeted. The long-term effects of how chemical weapons residue lives on and mixes with environments is an ongoing subject of investigation. My injuries resulted in my medical discharge at the age of 20 as a war pensioner. I subsequently went through 12 years of major surgeries and long periods of hospitalization, the long-term effects of which I still live with daily. After my discharge in 1994, I went on to complete a degree in photographic studies at the University of Derby. I gained my place there with the images just shown. Post-study, I started to make documentary work for various international publications, but stayed away from conflicts, partly because of my history and partly because I only wanted to go when I thought there was good reason to document something of difference rather than just adding to already existing narratives. In 2017, the New York Times magazine asked me if I'd go to Mosul during the battle for the city to document wrongly targeted coalition strike sites, which had resulted in civilian deaths. To defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the US coalition launched more than 27,000 airstrikes between 2014 and 2017. The munitions used, if correctly targeted, could hit a single vehicle or building, even a specific floor of a building, causing minimal damage to whatever surrounds it. The coalition went on record in the media declaring that this was the most accurate air campaign in history, noting that since August 2014, tens of thousands of ISIS fighters had been killed. The uncounted story came into being via the important and dangerous work carried out by investigative journalists Azmat Khan and Anand Gopal, who had spent months traveling around ISIS-held northern Iraq, locating strike sites, taking local witness statements, and spending time in Doha at US CENTCOM, sifting through freedom of information requests regarding strike site logs. Their investigation found that the tallies of US monthly strike sites claimed that just 466 civilians in Iraq had perished. The conclusion of Air Wars and other NGOs monitoring the situation put the civilian death toll much higher. Khan and Gopal's on-the-ground investigation disputed the coalition figure and identified the civilian death rate at 31 times what was officially acknowledged, 1 in 5 strike sites resulting in fatalities. The story focuses on Bassem Razou, who was the first person to challenge the coalition's narrative and question an airstrike which on the 20th of December 2015 destroyed his home, killing his wife Maida and teenage daughter Tuga, along with his brother Mohammed and nephew Najid, who were in a house next door. Only Bassem and his sister-in-law survived. After 15 months of pushing for truth, the coalition finally acknowledged and expressed regret that his family were wrongly targeted. They offered $15,000 as a condolence payment for the loss of his family. This was the first acknowledgement of its kind by the US and its allies in Syria and Iraq. Bassem refused the payment. The rest of the story covered numerous other sites located and investigated by Khan and Gopal to give a record and wider voice to the invisible casualties of the airstrikes. It called out the disinformation by questioning how casualty rates were arrived at and the quality and due diligence paid to the intelligence received by CENTCOM and the process in which targeting decisions were made from it. Historic local disputes were a part of some of the targeting as groups and individuals settled old scores. The images are mostly shot from a camera mounted on a 40-foot telescopic carbon fiber pole, framed and triggered from the ground by a Wi-Fi remote. But this wasn't the original approach for the story. It was arrived at because I couldn't take a drone into Iraq. From the initial availability in 2014, I'd been using Chinese-made consumer drones. That year, these same drones had been used in the Donbass region of Ukraine after its invasion by Russia, where they were utilized for reconnaissance purposes. But it was ISIS in 2016 who were the first to weaponize the use of these drones by easily modifying them with bombs, which resulted in the wide and proficient use during the Battle of Mosul. This meant that no one coming into Iraq could bring drones in, which was an effect to try and counter the ISIS supply lines. DJI, the Chinese manufacturer of the drones, put geolocation blocks on the software used to fly them in the hope that this would cut and limit ISIS use. It didn't, as countermeasures were found, including putting tin foil over the drone's GPS module. These same drones were also being used for reconnaissance purposes by the Iraqi army. While I was there, I was introduced to an off-duty Iraqi army officer who, along with getting me official permissions needed to fly, rented me his drone for a few days. Because of the geolocation blocks, I couldn't use the standard software flying apps, so I had to find a workaround. During my time flying consumer drones, I'd become interested in photogrammetry, the 3D capture and rendering of landscapes and objects with photographs. The history of photogrammetry has a similar timeline to that of aerial photography. As early as 1851, the French inventor Aimé Lucendin perceived the possibilities of its application to cameras used in mapping and surveying. The term photogrammetry was coined by the Prussian architect Albert Meydenbauer and appeared in his 1867 article Die Photometrographie as the science and technology of obtaining reliable information about physical objects and the environment through the process of recording, measuring, and interpreting photographic images and patterns of electromagnetic radiant imagery and other phenomena. It wasn't until 50 years later in the First World War when it and aerial photography finally came into being used as tools of military dominance. In the decade before World War I, terrestrial photogrammetry was used, but during the war, the much more effective technique of aerial photography, photogrammetry, was introduced. Excuse me. Where do I get the next slide? There. Aerial photogrammetry was used primarily for military map making and targeting purposes until the end of World War II. Thereafter, peacetime corporations uses expanded enormously. In Mosul, the photogrammetry software apps hadn't been geolocation blocked, so I used them. My interest in contemporary photogrammetry was the ability now afforded to the individual to be able to document three-dimensionally. I used the photogrammetry software to record some of the strike sites. This creates multiple types of data sets, both 2D, 3D, and moving. The NYT article was the first, to my knowledge, to use photogrammetry animation on an online editorial document story. Following the assignment, I kept in touch with the Iraqi officer I hired the drone from. After the fall of Mosul, he subsequently left the army and sold the drone to a local videographer, who he then connected me with. Following on from the 3D captures of strike sites, I became interested in documenting the wider legacy of the war against ISIS. The Al-Nuri Mosque had become a symbol of ISIS dominance and power during their caliphate. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, famously gave a sermon there while wearing a gold watch. They blew up the ancient mosque as a last act of vengeance before their final routing from the city. Over WhatsApp, I trained up Ayer Rasool, the new drone owner, to fly aerial photogrammetry apps. I then paid him to make a photogrammetry data set of the destroyed Al-Nuri Mosque in early 2018. He sent me the data and I did some testing with it and moved on to other projects I was making at the time. These images show you these initial tests. After this, Ayer got work with UNESCO, made in photogrammetry data sets of their sites in Mosul. Reconstruction of the city really started to gain momentum in 2019 when Qatar put $50 million towards the rebuilding of the Al-Nuri Mosque. It was during COVID lockdowns when I really started to think about documenting the reconstruction of Mosul remotely and what this means. At the time, the Battle of Mosul was the largest urban battle space since Stalingrad in World War II. A city of 2 million people affected by street-to-street fighting, which destroyed large parts in the process. The impact of consumer drone technologies during the battle had been a seismic change in dynamics, which had led to an intensification of conflict within vertical space, the politics of verticality. As Hito Still writes, the view from above is the perfect metonymy for the more general verticalization of class relations in the context of intensified class war from above. Vertical space, since the founding of civilizations, has been a position of power for those who control it, whether this is dominating high ground to build a castle or operating satellite networks and everything in between. Historically, this has been achievable by those with the money to harness it, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, mainly states with superior technologies. But consumer drones have brought a new hybrid warfare, which has affected peer-on-peer state conflict, the war in Ukraine, and allowed non-state groups, ISIS and individuals, the ability to operate and affect new types of outcome within the vertical paradigm. The US General Raymond A. Thomas III, commander of the Allied support to the Iraqi army during the Battle of Mosul, went on record in May 2017 saying, "There was a day when the Iraqi effort nearly came to a screeching halt, where literally over 24 hours there were 70 drones in the air. At one point there were 12 killer bees right overhead and underneath our air superiority, and our only available response was small arms fire." Consumer drones had allowed ISIS to challenge US air superiority in a major combat zone for a defined period. ISIS had located a key security gap and asymmetrically exploited it through cheap and creative means, while the US was spending millions of dollars to develop and deploy countermeasures. This has impacted on the scale and economics of conflict, where the mass supply and lower cost has started to impact on the expensive and limited supply of high-tech arsenals. The other first, which ISIS did with consumer drones, was to use propaganda video clips made by the drones of them targeting and dropping munitions on their enemies. As Paul Virilio states in his book War and Cinema, history of war has been a history of rapidly changing fields of perception, a contest of optical power. Consumer drones have added new field to this perception, Whether it's ISIS, Russian, Ukrainian generated, or Hamas released footage of IDF watchtowers being bombed, there is a widening of who can use and who is affected by a weaponized drone gaze. A drone stealth isn't just tactical, but also aesthetic. This visual dimension has extended beyond Western military utility and into the wider realms of geopolitics and information cultures. The use of dual-purpose technology in war and peace has a long history of trickle-down influence, especially in the 20th century from the industrial military complex into corporate civil use. As mentioned earlier, photogrammetry has been used by militaries since World War I for intelligence and targeting uses, and the 21st century by corporations like Google and Google Earth. The development and availability of consumer drones has since 2014 revolutionized its wider use for remote monitoring of building sites, archaeology, agriculture, scientific surveying of environmental impact. Phantom Pro employs the same model of consumer drone used by ISIS during the battle to show the lingering aftermath and regeneration of the city. It utilizes the collection, transfer, and interpretation of digital photographs using 21st century consumer technologies now used in war and construction industries. This was achieved against a security situation which meant that no drones could be flown in the city. But in 2022, Ayer said that he'd found someone who could grant permission to fly there legally. What followed was a long-winded 18-month process, including UNESCO and the Iraqi government. This resulted in photogrammetry data being collected by Ayer of various city sites, for which he was paid. He then sent the data, which I then interpreted using photogrammetry software. The documented landscapes show a range of areas from key sites of ISIS dominance, like the old city, the old area of the city, in the west of the city, which was their stronghold, the area of most intense fighting, the Al-Nuri Mosque and Al-Tariya Church, which were destroyed by them as acts of religious violence, the Al Jazeera Recreational Park, situated on an island in the Tigris River and used by them to execute people and throw their bodies into the river, the Al Batul Hospital, which was used as an ISIS headquarters. These areas are mixed with residential and commercial sites, which show the reconstruction and continuation of life after this traumatic period in the city's history. In doing so, it's created 3D landscapes which exist outside of military and corporate domains. Google Earth only 3D maps certain parts of the world. This denies visibility and leaves narrative holes in the three-dimensional documentation of the world. Photogrammetry, the history of photogrammetry's development and inherent properties are embedded within the industrial military complex, but the technology is not deterministic. Although photogrammetry is used as a measurement device to find scientific outcomes, it has faults caused by the quality and amount of photographs used. The more, the better quality and more accurate the end model would be. Areas not covered leave data holes. These data holes became very interesting metaphorically to me while making the work, as did the outlying data points, which resemble fragmented traces, but also have a sense of speed of gatherings or explosions. I've chosen the expressive strategy of leaving visible the computational processes and the photogrammetry artifacts as predicted by the software. These include blue rectangles for spatial volume measuring and the green crosses, the target-looking model tie points, which define the most aligned points of data in the model. The resulting work embraces rather than hides its origins. These visual tensions mirror the dual use of these technologies as weapons of war and tools of peace, and in doing so also comment on the repeated cyclical histories of conflict in that region, something which I have witnessed over the decades. The work is multifaceted in its output, as the process of photogrammetry creates many types of artifacts. What I'm showing you today are 2D landscapes I've made within the 3D rendered landscapes. We're trying to find narratives which challenge, extend traditional approaches to documenting conflict and aftermath. Phantom Pro tries to counter the type of information dominated by state or corporate interests by using technology which is today available to the individual. Thank you.